Okay, well, it's 30:30, so we'll make a start. Welcome everyone to the first Research Journey seminar of the year. It's great to see so many of you being able to join us today. So we've got two lovely speakers lined up for you. The first speaker will be Simon Skene, who is Professor of Medical Statistics at the University of Surrey and is also the Director of the Surrey Clinical Trials Unit. And then next we'll have Nikki Perry, who's also the Director of the Brighton and Sussex Clinical Trials Unit. So just before we get started, just a couple of notes. We're going to make the slides and the video recording available after the presentations. If you could keep yourself on mute until we get to the Q&As, that'd be great. We've also got a chat function that's open for you to use. So if you think of any questions as we go along, just pop them into the chat and you can either read them out yourself at the end or I'll read them out for you through our panel. And then after both speakers have spoken, we'll have a Q&A session and then I'll invite you to ask whichever questions you might have. So without further ado, first up is Simon. Do you want to take it away, Simon?
Okay, and again, we had one little practice run at this, but you'll shout if I get this wrong.
Yeah.
Can you see my, oh, I've got to say share.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
And is that on full screen mode?
Yep, you're on presenter mode. Yeah. Excellent,
brilliant. So, so thanks very much, and hello everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to speak to you today. It's great to get a chat. I mean, it's slightly unusual talking a little bit more about ourselves and how we got here rather than just the kind of research itself. But I'll give it a go. If it's not personal enough, then you can probe me in the questions afterwards. But if we start with some introductions, and Anne-Marie's already said who I am, but my name's Simon Skene. I'm a Professor of Medical Statistics and Director of the Clinical Trials Unit at the University of Surrey. I also wear another hat, which is a surprising one in terms of our research journeys, because it's not something I'd ever have seen, but I also act as the head of Department of Clinical and Experimental Medicine at the University of Surrey, which brings together a number of related functions, including the CTU. Primarily, I see myself as a trialist and a medical statistician, and facilitating, supporting, encouraging, fostering, collaborating. So working very closely with multidisciplinary teams in order that we have very well designed and very well undertaken clinical research projects. But a small disclaimer, we're talking about sort of clinical academic careers and things, a small disclaimer before we go, and that is just to absolutely stress that my full medical title, despite all the other qualifications, is Simon, as Ben Goldacre would say. So I'm not clinically qualified, but I do work very closely with many clinicians. So a tiny bit of context about where I sit within the university. So the Clinical Trials Unit is part of the Department of Clinical and Experimental Medicine. It's actually housed within this lovely building that you see at the bottom, called the Clinical Research Building. And we share that building with a sleep research centre and also our very own clinical research facility. So as well as being involved in the sort of design and management of studies, we can actually undertake a number of highly technical studies within our own building, which is quite unusual and but a great asset. We work very closely with the Research Design Service, so the Surrey hub of Research Design Service Southeast actually sit within the same department and actually administratively within the CTU. We work very closely with Surrey Health Economics Centre, and again, Professor Heather Gage is the health economics lead within the Research Design Service and also within the ARC across the region. So we're heavily built within the NIHR family across the region. Outside of the building, but in the same department, we also have a clinical medicine section. So all the clinical academics that have roles within the university sit within our department. And we hope we get to encourage as many of them as possible to actually undertake high quality clinical research involving participants, so that, because, as we'll come on to in terms of the kind of research that we do, CTUs and medical statisticians don't work in isolation. We need people with good quality research questions to come along and want to collaborate with us. And we also have a section of statistical multiomics, which is an increasing thread, the idea of bioinformatics and how CTUs interact with these things are, something that's becoming increasingly common. And again, just as an aside, because it'll come up within some of the research focus that I'll have later, is that we have a health technology accelerator, which has just joined us within the building. And this is a partnership between the university, some local trusts, particularly Surrey and Borders, NHS Trust, with the Applied Health Sciences Network and others, to provide a sort of safe space for the development of health technologies, and how can we evaluate them, validate them, and ensure they get implemented within in the healthcare system. So, and again, some of that we will touch on as we go. So in terms of my background, I guess first and foremost, as an academic statistician before becoming more applied, I studied maths originally, and statistics was kind of my applied maths. Usually people who study maths do pure maths and some form of applied maths. So either the more engineering side or statistics was what I chose. And over the course of my degree, became more and more passionate about the statistics and its the ability to use statistics to help answer questions of interest, rather than just doing maths for its own sake. And in common with my threads, I think one of the things here is that, so my educational background at the Open University, I had a degree before that from Aberdeen. I actually studied architecture originally. So again, in terms of research journey, this isn't my first career. It's something I settled into almost accidentally. There was a big recession in the middle of the 1990s. People were losing their careers in the jobs in the construction industry. And so coinciding with the start of our family coming along, I decided to stay at home for a while and study maths and see where it took me. And so that took me to finishing my maths degree and then immediately teaching maths with the OU, whilst then doing a master's in applied statistics at Birkbeck. And again, in terms of another thread through my career, in terms of sort of not being able to let go and sticking with things that I started. So not only did I then teach with the OU for 11 years, having done my degree there, having done my degree at Birkbeck, I then went back as a sessional lecturer while I was doing my PhD at the London School of Hygiene. And then again, my first academic job as lecturer was back at Birkbeck, where I'd already studied. So, so there's an overlapping thread here of the sort of background of looking for a career in statistics. Originally, I thought might become a maths teacher. When I was doing my Open University degree, I actually enjoyed the study so much, I decided to keep studying. So and statistics was my main passion, which is why I followed that at Birkbeck. And then it was, I think, my master's dissertation, which was looking at methods for analysis of longitudinal data, that drove me to then do a PhD in that. So it was, so there was no grand plan originally about getting into, becoming an academic or a boffin or whatever you want to call it, and sticking with statistics. It was kind of accidental and incremental. But during the time at the London School of Hygiene, it was impossible not to learn about clinical trials and the use of statistics there, and particularly with the likes of Stuart Pocock, who's a massive authority in terms of clinical trials being there, and pushing me to not just doing statistics for its own sake, but having a goal and having the methodology that I was looking at, making sure it matched some real research needs, was something that I took very seriously, and led to some consultancy with the pharmaceutical industry and involvement in trials. So then at Birkbeck as a lecturer, and it was kind of strange because you're employed on your teaching part, and there was always almost a free rein of, you need to find your own research track alongside. And I was looking at methodology that was linked to trials, but I wasn't really doing it in a very applied way. It was really just looking at the dry methodology itself. And I think where I really got the passion was interacting with students on their research projects, which were all real life based. And I found that I just started to feel that I'd be much happier working as an applied statistician, working on real life projects, rather than my real life focus being through interaction with students. And so that led me back in 2013 to make a move into UCL, but rather than following the pure academic route, moving into one of the clinical trials units. So I joined the UCL Comprehensive Clinical Trials Unit. It was actually called the UCL Clinical Trials Unit at the time, but then UCL discovered they had 4 clinical trials units, so letting one of them call themselves the UCL Clinical Trials Unit seemed a bit unfair. So it was relabeled as comprehensive, and that was the idea behind that, was that the other trials units all had primary research focuses, like the Cancer Trials Centre at UCL or the MRC Clinical Trials Unit, which had just joined UCL at that point. And we're looking at infectious diseases and cancer and novel international trials, and also PRIMENT, which is the primary health and mental care trials unit. And there was a need for another trials unit to pick up all the rest of the research that was happening at UCL. And UCL, obviously a massive institution with lots of medical researchers, 2 medical schools. There was a massive amount of research, hence the need for a comprehensive trials unit. It's a dreadful name and we all hated it, but it really did recognize what it did. And so for 5 years there, having thrown myself in, and I had to persuade them quite heavily to begin with that someone who'd had a more traditional academic route could actually speak to people and engage with clinicians and work in an applied sense. I just absolutely got absorbed in working across, literally tens or hundreds of trials, from speaking to people about trial ideas, working on funding applications, and then seeing through a portfolio of trials that we had. So I was with the UCL Comprehensive Clinical Trials Unit from just after the time when they were launched, when they had 2 or 3 trials. And I was there for almost 5 years, saw them through both provisional and full registration. And, I think by the time I left, there were sort of 6 or 7 of us when I joined. By the time I left, I think it was a trials unit of sort of 40 or 50 staff, and with a program of 40 or 50 trials. So quite a transformation, and fitting in within something which was set up around the same time, which is the Institute of Clinical Trials and Methodology at UCL, which contained the 4 clinical trials units and had about 400 trialists working under the same roof. So really a massive learning experience. And, that's where I really cut my teeth in clinical trials, primarily as a statistician, but also learning very quickly about the whole multidisciplinary aspect of clinical trials. And the thing that I loved was the fact that, it always seemed to me there was a real triangle, if you like, of statistics and methodology meeting the practical clinical side, and also the operational element and trial management front. And, those 3 things really coming together within trials and also being important. And I guess, after 5 years there and being part of the establishment, that's when, there was a knock on the door. Would I be interested in moving down to Surrey? There was a fledgling clinical trials unit there, which was part of a larger clinical research centre. And they really wanted someone who'd had experience in a larger clinical trials unit to come and see whether we could, push to build a portfolio of studies. And so that's where I've been since 2018. And the CTU at Surrey was set up in around 2015. It got provisional registration with UK CRC almost immediately on its establishment, which was probably a little bit too early. And in 2019, we managed to get full registration. And as part of that process of unpicking the clinical research centre at Surrey and moving things forward, that I got the dual role as head of department, as I said earlier. So in terms of clinical trials and how we see them, I think this cartoon from XKCD really sums it up. The idea that someone comes up with an idea, they convince people it's a good idea, and then the new idea is adopted. And if we put the thing which is in red in there, saying actually it's a pretty good idea to get some evidence, let's check whether this thing works first before we persuade everyone to use it. And they've said that point, or that light bulb moment, if you like, is the invention of clinical trials. And so that's really what it is. It's how do we design proper evaluation studies to provide the highest quality evidence for our interventions and ensure that the best ones get implemented. And that's what that's all about. So in terms of clinical trials units, I suspect Nikki will have a very similar slide to this, so I won't dwell on it too much. But clinical trials units really just specialist units, that here primarily to support the design, conduct, analysis, and publication of trials and other well-designed studies, because we do work on a number of things that aren't traditional clinical trials. The key thing is that we have to have all the expertise in-house and all the different skill sets, so that we have access to statisticians, epidemiologists, and other people with proper methodological advice, and also coordination teams, trial managers, database programmers, data managers, and so on to handle the whole thing. And at the moment, there are 53 registered clinical trials units around the UK. I'm delighted that we're joined on that by Brighton CTU, and also the CTU, which is now coming at Kent as well. So that really there's a good spread across the region now, which wasn't perhaps there 5 years ago. So in terms of why, my role primarily is a statistician within trials, and I still do try to turn my hand to statistics when I can, and not just work on all the administrative aspects and making sure everyone else is there. R.A. Fisher is perhaps the most famous of statisticians of the last century, apart from David Cox, of course, who died last week. Always said to consult the statistician after an experiment is finished is often merely to ask him, and that's a function of the time, ask them to conduct a post-mortem examination. They can say what the experiment died of. And the idea that a statistician's worst nightmare is when someone comes up and taps them on the shoulder with a spreadsheet and says, I've got some data, so it's the idea that, and again, this is something that I got from Stuart Pocock and others at the London School of Hygiene, that statistics isn't just about the analysis at the end. It's, the actual study should be designed to collect the data, which is going to allow the appropriate analysis. So the kind of embedding statisticians throughout, alongside all the other members, not replacing them, but just recognizing that role is very important. And of course, within good clinical practice, a quote from the Grey Book, it's enshrined there that those advising on trial design, methodology, etc., should demonstrate relevant qualifications and experience. Of course, they don't define what that means, but I guess we all have our own ideas about that. But that role of statistics within clinical research is enshrined, but I'm not at all stating that it's more important than any of the other aspects. So of course, I throw these publications up, not because they're necessarily best, but just to give a range of an idea of the studies we did. So when I joined UCL, as well as having a hat to improve some of the methodology and robustness of the stats group, I was actually given three trials to start with as a jobbing statistician. That was back in 2013. Two of them have reported. The third one is just reporting at the moment. So the other thing to bear in mind is in terms of clinical research careers, in terms of trials can take a long time. So the first three trials I was given 7 years later, and we're still waiting to report on one of them. And of course, as well as the publications, you also generate the odd headline. And of course, the best one here, the exenatide trial, which was a phase 2 trial, just looking at, was there any evidence that it was worth pursuing, any proof of concept? Is it worth pursuing the idea that exenatide, which is a diabetes treatment, may also be beneficial for those with Parkinson's? Picked up by the Daily Mail as test results suggest the treatment could stop the disease in its tracks. Of course, that's not at all what the paper says. The paper says there may be some benefit to people from taking this drug alongside existing treatments, but we're evidence-based, but we also guard against hyperbole in our in terms of our results. And so a range of and again, this is just the idea of taking the experience of having been at the comprehensive clinical trials unit. And one of the things that I love the most about working with people who come through the door with ideas is just the range of different types, different therapeutic areas, different interventions that we work with. So this is just a page that flags some of the current funding that I hold, either with the CTU or separately, and a range of studies, with funding from the HTA and EME from NIHR and RFPB. And one of the things I've been very keen on within the regional context, working closely with RDS and others, is that the CTU here can support research for benefit studies, something we weren't allowed to touch at UCL because there no money in it. Whereas I always think that engaging with clinicians from their early ideas and working with them through the feasibilities mean you're the best place to then to work with them on the larger studies. So we find where we can creative ways to work with people on those more radical or early evidence studies. And and some of these have been some of these RFPB studies have been a great joy to us. So Dipper, which is highlighted in the middle there, it was looking at the feasibility of carrying out palliative care research in children's groups. And it's an absolutely horrific subject, but a very important area from research, and it's been very rewarding, particularly working with the PPI representatives on that. And we've been working very closely to get a PPI paper out about how PPI has really informed the research there. So just to highlight one study in particular, and this is the largest study that we have at the CTU at the moment. It was funded last year by HTA. And it's partly as well to talk about the process. So back in 2015, a pilot study under RFPB was performed by the CTU here at Surrey, looking at whether a program of targeted hydration could help reduce agitation at the end of life. And it was a successful pilot study, but it didn't immediately lead to a successfully funded larger study, much to our disappointment. Last year, we did finally get a successful funding application. So this is a project which is almost 10 years in the making, and now we're starting just on the large scale study. And working with Professor Andrew Davis, who's now at Trinity College Dublin, but is going to be a large study looking at 1,600 patients in the final days of their life across 80 hospice and palliative care centres across the UK. In terms of other things, a new direction that we're getting involved in, we said earlier about the Health Technology Accelerator. A large amount of what we do now is not the traditional drug therapies. We also work on behavioural interventions, but increasingly on digital health technologies. And that's something that as a CTU, we've got quite involved in. There's a new people-centered AI institute at Surrey that we've tied up with. And a number of our studies are looking at whether, for example, apps can support people in the self-management of their symptoms whilst undergoing chemotherapy. And through the AI in Healthcare Awards through NHSX, we're working very closely with the Applied Health Sciences Network evaluation team as a collaborative technology-specific evaluation team, or TSETs as we're called, working in 2 rounds of that study. One, a nationwide study looking at Deloitte's automatic triaging system of patients into secondary care, and whether that should be approved for national rollout. And from round 2, working on a digital screening device for cancer, and looking at two parallel studies, one in primary care and one in secondary care. So whilst asking the question, does this help with the referring people to the right pathway, we're also asking second question was, where should this intervention happen? Is it best placed in primary care or secondary care? So a lot of really interesting things, and there it's always very important separating out questions of does the technology do what it says, in terms of does the technology work? And then secondly, does it actually make a difference to patient outcomes? And those questions often get muddled up, but they're 2 entirely separate questions to me, because it's quite natural that the technology does do what it says, but it doesn't make any difference. And I think unpicking these things is something that we've become quite concerned with.
Simon, just to let you know, we're just about to run over on time.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say, I won't go through these in detail, but just to say, one of the great parts of what we do, or what I get to do, and one of the things that I love, as I said before, was just the interactions I have. So that's also with, so my MD and PhD students are all medical, and I have joint supervisors, and I've listed those there, sit on review panels and so on. The last slide was going to be just what advice I would give people, but I'll save that for questions so that I don't
good idea.
Time.
Yeah, that'd be really helpful.
And thank you for pulling me up.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, fascinating to hear how you came from architecture to clinical trials. Great.